Well, welcome to NAC and Grace Place. Somebody, and I don't think it was anybody either here at Grace Place, sent me this story this week, and it was too good to share, and I had to figure out some way to make it sort of tie into what we're talking about. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll be able to do this. It seems like it's got to be a Texas rancher. I mean, it sounds like something that would happen there. That a DEA agent paid this guy a visit. And so he's talking to him out in front of his house, and he said, "I'm here, and I need to search your property. I need to look around your property." And the rancher said, "That's fine. I have no problem with that. Just don't go to that pasture over there." And the DEA agent says, "Now you need to understand something. I represent all the authority of the federal government." He whipped out his badge. He said, "You see this badge right here? This badge gives me permission to go anywhere, anytime, for any reason. Do you understand that?" And the rancher says, "All right, I'm sorry. Feel free." And so the rancher goes about his business. And in a little while, he hears this scream for dear life from this guy, and he comes around the side of his house, and he sees this DEA agent out there in the pasture being chased by his prize bull. And it looks like the bull is going to catch up to this guy, and this guy is screaming, "Help me, help me." And the rancher yells out, "Show him your badge." All right, we're going to tie that in. There is a point here. We all recognize this image of this character, even if you're not a real student of history. It's like everybody, at least in America, knows who Benjamin Franklin is. And Franklin was a remarkable man. The more I read about him, the more intrigued I am. He was a brilliant man. He was the guy who introduced bifocal glasses to those of you that are blessed with that experience. He was the one who actually had a hand in the creation of the public libraries, and of a lot of other things that we enjoy, as a people here. And interestingly enough, one of his best sayings, and we're using it as sort of as a backdrop for our study, is he said this: "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." Now, what's interesting is that most people don't understand the context in which this very famous saying occurs. That one of the things also that Franklin was involved in promoting was public safety in terms of fire prevention, because that was one of the things that was really dangerous in urban settings back in his day, because they didn't have the modern sprinkler system, the fire suppression system. And he was the one who promoted the first fire insurance and the starting of public fire departments. And it was in this context of fire prevention that he gave us this very famous saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In our study on kingdom thinking, and we're bringing this thing into a conclusion, and then I'm going to use next week for doing something to sort of wrap up the year as we move forward. I thought this was probably a pretty good note to sort of end this study on, because I know that and I hope you're not offended by this, but the kind of folks that end up gravitating to NAC, and we've talked about this in recent weeks about how it's better to learn from the mistakes of others. I think last week it was the stupidity of others that we talked about, and that we're not really good about that. We want to practice our own stupidity, and hopefully we learn from that. In terms of a spiritual journey, and the fact that we're talking about these whole issues of what it is to know God and to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, and to do it in such a way that affects our very thought processes, because our thought processes, or the absence thereof, is what shapes our actions and our conduct and our words and where we go and what we do, and whether in fact we are a real reflection of who we ought to be as a result of our relationship with God. But how many mistakes do we make along the way that we simply do not have to make? Isn't it far better to prevent a problem than to have to solve a problem? And how much of the teaching of Jesus and the writing, certainly of the New Testament folks, is about helping people equip themselves in a thinking process so you don't have to do the dumb things that perhaps others do. And for that reason, I wanted to sort of end this in finding the ounce of prevention in kingdom thinking in our study this weekend. So take your outlines and let's fill in some of these blanks here. The first thing we need to do is to heed the advance warnings of others. Now, let me sort of frame this for us a little bit as we move forward in our study. That the book of Romans is really divided. There's 16 chapters there, and it's divided not necessarily equally, because the first 11 chapters, theologians consider those sort of the theological backbone of Paul's teaching and New Testament Christianity. It's very theological in content. And beginning in chapter 12, it moves from orthodoxy to orthopraxy, and that is putting into practice those principles and those teachings and those truths of the first 11 chapters. And so for that reason, we read these words in chapter 13. But Paul says that we ought to heed the warning of others. I don't expect anybody to really recognize this Latin. I would not have I not done the study this week. Praemonitus, praemunitus. By any chance, do anybody here really know what that means in English? Bob, do you know what that means in English? Okay, well, Bob's the one person I would expect to know this. It was actually, this saying was used by Don Quixote in his famous quest. Let me see, before I tell you what this means, let me sort of frame it like this. So, I had a couple people send me this picture here because they knew it would bless me at this special season of the year that I'm just so enthralled with. And I guess the caption ought to go with this is just, buyer beware, you engage in this stuff for the holiday season, this is what you expect. We don't know what happened to this poor soul out there trying to hang lights, probably because his wife asked him to, or to make his kids happy, although none of them are in the scene holding the ladder or coming to his rescue. That perhaps doesn't help you at all. This Latin expression actually means to be forewarned is to be what? Forearmed. It's exactly what it means. Given the fact that this past Monday was, December the 7th, which was the date of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Some of us were not around back then. If I do my math correctly, Brother Dallas at Grace Place, I think you were born that year. I could be wrong. It's sort of interesting. I went because I minored in history in college, and I've sort of majored in history much of my life, and primarily in church history. And one of the areas that I spent a good bit of time reading and researching was in post 1916 in America history. And I came across a story about this book right here entitled The Deceit at Pearl Harbor. And let me just share some tidbits based not only on this book but on some others that have come out in recently. This was actually written by a man who was there. He was at Pearl Harbor. He was the last surviving man on the commander at Pearl Harbor on his ship. He was in Japan at the end of the war. So this man saw the whole thing, and he writes, he says, perhaps the most astounding revelation in this book is the transcript of the telephone conversation between Churchill and Roosevelt 11 days before Pearl Harbor. That Roosevelt ignored the warning from Churchill that a large Japanese task force was on its way to Pearl Harbor. I don't know if you knew this. Listen to some of these other things. In the Grand Joint Army-Navy exercises of 1932, 9 years before, Pearl Harbor was attacked in a training simulation by 152 planes a half hour before dawn on a Sunday. An attack which caught the defenders of Pearl Harbor completely by surprise. In 1938, Admiral Ernst King led a carrier-borne airstrike from the USS Saratoga against Pearl Harbor in another exercise. Again, the attackers were successful and achieved total surprise. On January the 27th, 1941, this is at the beginning of the year of that fateful year, Dr. Ricardo Schreiber, the Peruvian envoy to Tokyo, told a secretary in the U.S. Embassy that he had learned from intelligence sources of a war plan involving a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. This information was sent to the State Department and Naval Intelligence and to Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii. On March the 31st, 1941, a Navy report predicted that if Japan made war on the U.S., they would strike Pearl Harbor without warning at dawn with aircraft from a maximum of 6 carriers. On August the 10th, 1941, a top British agent, codenamed Tricycle, told the FBI that a planned attack on Pearl Harbor would occur very soon. It is amazing that our leaders received advance warning, and yet they did not fulfill this very famous saying about being forewarned was to be forearmed. To be a kingdom thinker and to avoid some of these things, this is like one of the most famous pictures that I found of that event that took place back then, is to not listen to these warnings. And what we need to do is to learn from those ahead of us on the spiritual curve, to heed the advance warning of others, because wherever you are in your personal spiritual journey, some of you actually may not be at that place where you have begun that journey in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Most of you actually have. And we are all over the spectrum. I know both here and at Grace Place and in all of our services, there are people who have just entered into the kingdom of God, and then there are some of us who have been in the trenches for a long time. Some of the best wisdom we will ever hear to assist us as kingdom thinkers and to avoid some of the pitfalls and mistakes that we perhaps might make is to listen to those that are just ahead of us on the spiritual curve. For a person who's just entered into a relationship with Jesus Christ, it's somebody who's been on the journey for, say, 5 years, and they've been sort of feeling their way along and growing, and they can tell you, do this and don't do this. Trust me, you really don't want to do this because it will not take you where you want to go. Spending time with people who are just ahead of us on the spiritual curve is one of the ways to be forearmed and to be forewarned and to not make some of the critical mistakes that we make in our spiritual journey. Not only from those ahead of us on the spiritual curve, but those ahead of everyone on the spiritual curve. And who are those that are ahead of everyone on the spiritual curve? Those that brought us this awesome book right here. The men and women that penned these words under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And look at the introduction to the man who wrote the book of Romans. Verse 1 of chapter 1, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Verse 11, I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. There are warnings that we can hear. There are warnings that we can receive if we get them from the right source. And either from those that are just ahead of us on the spiritual curve, or those of us that have passed on into glory, who have recorded for us the instruction in this book. Paul states his purpose here in writing the book of Romans. And the other 20 out of the 27 that he wrote out of the New Testament, he gave us much of that. He is writing to give what? Insight and wisdom and advice. Because trust me, and this is one of those areas that I can't emphasize enough, is to let biblical characters and biblical writers be human also. Trust me, Paul didn't get it right all the time. He fouled up, he botched it, he got it wrong, he made mistakes, and he writes out of his own experience, both from the inspiration of the Spirit and from his own failures, to encourage us that what? We might be strengthened as a result of that spiritual journey. And so to heed those warnings is to say, I want to know the right thing and I want to know the wrong thing to avoid, because I don't want to make those same mistakes as a part of my spiritual journey. Number 2 is to prepare for the obvious areas of assault. Prepare for the obvious areas of assault. Now, with all of that information that we have since read about in history and all the advanced warnings that our military and our nation's leaders had leading up to December the 7th, 1941, it was believed that it would be an aerial attack, an aerial assault. As a matter of fact, it was pretty interesting. I read this. Also, this person writes in and talks about somebody that he was in temporary charge of a multi-million filter center in the mountain close to Fort Shafter on December the 7th. He said, I called the filter center at 5:45 a.m. Sunday, December 7, and asked to talk with senior officer in charge. The telephone operator told me there were only 4 people there. The duty officer, a second Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, was in his second day of training and an observer of overall plotting. I finally talked to him and told him to immediately call someone with authority and pass the word that we have picked up over 150 blips on our radar screen and to get some action right away. He gave me a bunch of BS, and as far as he was concerned, there was no action needed at that time. He had at least an hour and a half of time to warn Pearl, but he chose to do nothing. In light of the history of what they had discovered, it was believed that the primary way that the enemy would attack was by air. In the same way, for us in our spiritual journey, there are some areas, there are some places in our relationship with God, in our relationship with our world and those around us, that it would be rather conspicuous where the assault might come from. There are those that test the integrity of our love, those assaults that test the integrity of our love. Look at how Paul says this in chapter 13 and verse 8. He says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law." Now, you really need to get the context of this passage right here, because it has been it's been ripped out of its context more than a few times, especially by people who are financial planners and Christian educators in that, in terms of saying that this passage says that you shouldn't be in debt for anything, and that's not at all what this passage is talking about. It's talking about an obligation that we have to the people in our lives, and whether it's somebody that we owe respect to or somebody we owe something else to. And Paul says, he says, you ought to pay your debts, but there's one debt that never gets completely paid off. He said, is that continuing debt to love each other. And he said, if we live in such a way, if our thinking and our attitude and our actions and our conduct and our character are such that we recognize the people in our life and as a reflection of Jesus Christ and his love for us, and that led him to die for us, that if we're to do that, then when we think about those people around us in our lives, whether they know God or not, we have a spiritual obligation to never have the debt of love completely paid off. And he says that when we live in such a way that our actions and our words and our attitudes are driven by this love relationship that we have for each other, he says there's sort of an interesting benefit that comes out of that. He says in the latter part of this verse, he said, "For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law." It's sort of interesting that a lot of people think of Christianity and a relationship with God is about what? The do's and the don'ts. Whether you keep the 10 Commandments or whether you break the 10 Commandments. It's all about rules and regulations. And Paul would say it goes far beyond that. It includes that, and we'll see in just a moment, but it goes far beyond that. He says if we have the right kind of love relationship and attitude, both toward God and people in our lives, we're going to do by the Spirit and by a spiritual nature those things that satisfy and fulfill the law. And so he says, as a kingdom thinker, he says that we ought to have a debt of love that never gets completely paid off. And B, those that test the consistency of our obedience. The consistency of our obedience. If I have a... boy, that's a deadly word there. I was going to say, if I have any pet peeves, and it's like, well, who doesn't? I have a couple. One of mine is inconsistency on the part of anybody. And so this word appears a lot in my teaching. Those that test the consistency of our obedience. These are the obvious avenues that we're likely to be assaulted in our spiritual journey. In verse 9 of Romans 13, Paul says, "The commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandments there may be are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law." It's never enough, as much as we just stated the strength and the power and the motivation that love ought to be in our relationship with each other as a result of our walk in a relationship with Jesus Christ. That it ought to compel us to do those things that are in keeping with the law. It doesn't leave the details of the law out. It's not enough to say, I love, unless we're doing those things that are compliant with what God has spelled out. And so the two areas that we're likely to receive some sort of spiritual assault in terms of whether we're obeying God or walking with Him is how we love each other, and whether we are consistent with keeping those things that God has called us, in fact, to do. Number 3, is to elevate awareness of exposed areas of risk. You know, there are those high profile areas that we can get in trouble in our love relationship, because there's some things we're not going to do if we love. There's some things we are going to do if we don't love. But there are some areas that we are somewhat at risk. This is sort of an interesting thing in the readings about, as a matter of fact, I found this post on one of the websites. It was a question that was written in, and this is from Nick Bowman. I don't know who that is. Quote, "My friend is trying to convince me that Japan used submarines to attack Pearl Harbor. But we all know that it was planes from aircraft carriers, right? What can you tell me about the attack? Is my friend totally nuts?" I remember seeing, I think it was either Time or Life magazine several years back, this article about this very subject, and it intrigued me. And in preparation for today, I went back and read some more of this. And this is the response that this man got. He says, "No, your friend is not totally nuts. When the Japanese Navy launched its attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, that brought the United States into World War II, the strike included both carrier-based aircraft and small midget submarines. The main Japanese force consisted of 31 ships, including 6 aircraft carriers that launched the air raid on the U.S. installation on the island of Oahu. An expeditionary force of 28 submarines was also sent from Japan, primarily to scout the area around the island and report movement of U.S. ships before the attack. 11 of these submarines carried amphibious scout planes for reconnaissance, while another 5 carried midget submarine designed to participate in the attack." Now, when I was in school, I don't remember those details about Pearl Harbor, because I always thought it was the planes dropping these torpedoes and these bombs. But in fact, this is one of the midget subs that was found. It's sort of interesting in reading the reports that when the launch took place and those first bombers appeared, that there were people that had sightings of the conning tower of some of these midget subs, and these battleships were shooting at these things in and around the harbor. And it's been speculated for years that perhaps it was some of these submarines that accounted for some of the devastation and destruction of some of our finest ships. This is a picture that has been studied by historians, and they say in the water here, this is called Battleship Row there. If you look at that, they're all just lined up. This is just amazing footage. You can see that the air attack has already taken place in the background, the smoke that's coming up. That in the waters out there is that they're believed to be the lines left by a torpedo that was perhaps launched by a midget submarine. And historically, what it discovered is they found 4 of these midget submarines, and it was suspected there was a 5th that they do not know what happened to it until this year. They found the 5th midget submarine, and is believed to have launched 2 800-pound torpedoes there in that bay that struck one of those battleships. You see, it's one thing to watch on the horizon and to see, you got the radar to show you the planes, the typical avenues of assault in a war, but it's another thing when you've got those things running around underneath the surface that are so small that you may get false readings on whether they're there or not unless you catch a glimpse of one somewhere. They're likely to slip into the harbor because the harbor was designed so that a regular submarine could not get in and out of there undetected, but these midget subs could. And I got to thinking, as I'm reading this stuff, I'm thinking, we spend so much time in our spiritual journey looking at the big picture and the big avenues of assault that are likely to come upon us. To stay away from certain people and to stay away from certain places. And if you do that, then you're likely to not only survive but succeed in your walk and your relationship with Christ. But how many of us go down because we're not watching those things that are just under the surface, that slip through the net, that slip into our lives because we're not aware that they are there and the hazards that they bring with them? You see, those exposed areas of risk for us, there is the assumption of safety. There is the assumption of safety. Look at how Paul talks about this. Picking up in verse 11. He says, and do this, understanding the present time. The hour has come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The idea of any person in pursuit of a relationship with God, that somehow there's a time and a place when you can actually relax from the spiritual challenges that come sort of with the job. That there's this area of safety. Paul is writing to these people in first century Christianity. He says there's never a time for you to spiritually sleep, because he says you don't know how soon we're going to be at the final destination to start with. That this assumption that there's a safe place and time to be, that you can relax spiritually. The truth of the matter is, there is no safe place for the believer. You can't even walk through the doors of this place or Grace Place and say, I am in a safe place from the devil. He can't get to me here. Guess what? You may have brought him with you. For all I know. It's this assumption, the fact that we believe that we can be safe is a part of this exposed area, which brings us to sort of the second one. And that is the dropping of our guard. Because when we get to that place where we think it is safe and we can sort of stop pressing and stop trying so hard and stop searching and stop moving ahead, that we can actually drop our guard. Paul says this in verse 12. He said, the night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. He says there's just no place in time for the believer to say it's safe. It's sort of like, I was thinking about this. We're getting ready at our house to have a gathering on Sunday evening for our trustees and spouses and our staff and their spouses at our home. And so my wife and I are frantically trying to get stuff taken care of. You know what it's like when you got company coming to your home. It's like you don't want them to see how you live all the time. You know what I mean. Well, anyway, so we've got all this stuff going on, and I've got all these unfinished projects in my house and construction stuff, and there's going to be 30 people. I mean, we're growing by leaps and bounds in our leadership. And we got 30 people, coming to our house. Like, so where is everybody going to sit, and where is everybody going to eat, and how we're going to get all this stuff done? And so like on Saturday morning, it's get up and it's like, how much can we get done, before the Saturday service, and go into the kitchen, and my wife says, where does water come from on the floor? I'm thinking, well, you probably spilled something. And she's thinking, you probably spilled something. And so, mop it up, and, well, maybe it's just, a little bit later, there's a puddle there again. It's like, oh, man. I don't know if this happened to you, but open up the doors under the sink and look under there and start pulling stuff out. It's like a woman's purse under there. Everything in the world under there. And sure enough, there's a drip in my plumbing under the sink. I'm thinking, I don't need this right now. I'd like to think there's a time when I can sort of relax and take it easy and say, it's all in hand. It's all under control. I've concluded that place and time does not exist in my life. Paul would say, listen, you make the same mistake if you think there are places and times spiritually that you can do that either. He says, because if you think you're in a safe place and you drop your guard, you're putting yourself at risk for any one of these things, and it can happen to anyone. And then C, the pursuit of our Christ likeness. Whether you've been told this, whether you've read this, but entering into a relationship with Jesus Christ is the beginning of a lifetime journey that will carry us into eternity. And it's not to create a bunch of clones to be like the preacher or to be like some teacher. It's not to see how many rules and regulations that we can create to govern our lives, to make us more holy and less unholy. It's this whole business of shaping us so that we are in fact a genuine reflection of the person and the character and the attributes of Jesus Christ. Paul puts it like this in verse 14. He says, rather clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the sinful nature. Those two things go together. Where we focus and what happens as a result of that focus. Let me sort of illustrate it like this. This is the cover of Time magazine from March I believe it's 31st, 1986. The only reason I put this up here is because the image that appears up here in the corner. Some of you are old enough. No, let me correct that. Some of you are seasoned enough. Remember, that's our new language after last week. Some of you are seasoned enough to have remembered the events of the 80s when the famous couple from the Philippines, the Marcoses, were in power. Imelda Marcos, does that even ring a bell for you? This is the time her picture appeared on the cover of Time magazine. I'm really surprised it didn't appear more often than that. They were in power there, and apparently they just absolutely ravaged the economics of that country and made themselves filthy rich in the process. And there was a matter of fact, here's a picture of them in 1982 with President Reagan when they were allies of ours in a lot of ways, but there was a people's revolt that drove them from power and drove them from the country. And the thing that we remember most from that about her, and I even read more. This is a little scary. Matter of fact, this is a quote from her. Apparently, she was very quotable. I love beauty, and I'm allergic to ugliness. Well, anyway, when they fled power, listen to what she left behind. Let's see if I can find all this information. It wasn't just the shoes. After the Marcos family fled, the Marcoses were found to have left behind 15 mink coats, 508 gowns, 1,000 handbags, and 3,000 pairs of shoes. Actually, it was 2,700, but who's counting after that? Somebody did an estimation of 2,700 pairs of shoes. Listen to this. If Imelda Marcos changed her shoes 3 times a day and never wore the same pair twice, it would take her more than 2 years and 5 months to work through her shoe supplies as it existed on the day she fled Manila. Since she undoubtedly would continue to buy new shoes even while trying to do justice to the old supply, it is clear she could never wear all of her shoes. Now, we remember that because it was we were astounded. This woman just had housefuls of shoes. And I thought in this context of kingdom thinking and what Paul says about, he says, but put on Jesus Christ. Put on Jesus Christ and don't make provisions to the flesh. Imelda Marcos was so obsessed with clothing and shoes that she did everything she could to have more and more and more. And I thought if I, as a believer, am so fixated on the character and the person of Jesus Christ in me, if Paul says we're supposed to be putting on Jesus Christ, shouldn't we be so possessed of that drive and that desire that people in our lives will look and say, look at all the Jesus things in you. Obviously, you're taken with this man. And it's sort of interesting that in that passage, Paul says if we put on Jesus, if we clothe ourselves in Christ and in Christ's likeness, it takes away those opportunities and it takes away that drive to do those things that simply do not please God. So I've summarized it in this statement. When we become so consumed with clothing ourselves in the character and the attributes of Jesus that there is no living without it, we will have discovered that ounce of prevention and truly become kingdom thinkers. I want you to bow your heads.